The snow was relentless that night in Everpine. Most stayed inside, warm, safe, but one man heard something, a sound so faint it could have been the wind, but it wasn't. It was a cry, a whimper, buried beneath the snow, and what Walter Hayes uncovered wasn't just 6 dying golden retriever puppies. He found hope, a reason to believe again, and what he did next would touch hearts across the world. The snowstorm had settled over Everpine like a heavy sigh, muffling sound and blurring shapes into a white, trembling canvas. Located on the edge of the Colorado Rockies, Everpine was the kind of town forgotten by time. Quiet, sparse, a scattering of wood-framed homes and silent pine trees weighed down by ice. It was early January, the coldest week of the year, and the streets were deserted as wind tore through the town like a wolf's howl. Walter Hayes lived on the outer rim of Everpine, in a cabin that had once been filled with warmth and laughter. Now, it was mostly silence. At 62, Walter had the roughness of a man shaped by years of labor, broad-shouldered, with a heavy beard now silvered with age, deep lines carved beneath his eyes, and hands scarred from work and time. His gait was steady, but careful, a slight limp on the left from an accident long past. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago, Walter withdrew from most of the town. He had once worked as a night guard for a private kennel operation, until the day he walked out, disgusted by the way animals were bred and kept, never forgetting the cries of a mother dog separated from her litter. That night, Walter had gone out back to collect the last load of firewood from under the tarp-covered stack near his shed. The wind bit through his flannel coat, and the snow whipped in flurries against his boots. He grunted, pulling his scarf tighter, and was about to turn back when he paused. At first, it sounded like a creaking branch, but then it came again, a soft, reedy noise, so faint it almost blended with the wind. A whimper. Walter stood still, breath held. It came again, a plaintive, desperate whine. Frowning, he grabbed his flashlight from the hook by the door and stepped into the woods behind his property, following the sound into the trees. His boots crunched through fresh snow, his breath forming thick clouds. The wind grew louder, and the noise nearly vanished, but he followed it anyway. 10 minutes in, behind a fallen log and beneath a drift, something caught the light, a corner of burlap, half frozen and crusted with ice. He knelt, hands shaking more from fear than cold, and pulled it back. The smell hit him first, urine, blood, and filth. Inside the bag, barely moving, were 6 tiny bodies. Golden fur, matted and crusted with dirt. Puppies. They couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 weeks old. Walter's breath caught. One lifted its head feebly, then let it drop. Another twitched, a broken sound slipping from its throat. Their bellies were bloated, likely from parasites or starvation. Several had small, crusted wounds on their backs and legs. One had a slice across its ear. Another's front paw was twisted unnaturally. Walter didn't think. He scooped the whole bag into his arms, cradling them to his chest. "Hold on, babies," he whispered, voice trembling. "You're not dying out here." The snow clung to his beard. His knees buckled once on the icy slope, but he didn't stop. The wind howled as if trying to turn him back. He kicked the door open with his foot and stormed inside, laying the bag gently on a worn wool blanket near the fire. His cabin was modest, 1 bedroom, a potbelly stove, a radio that barely worked, and dozens of old photographs on the mantel. He lit the fire higher, boiling water in a kettle. Then, he gently took the puppies out, one by one, wrapping them in towels, warming their feet and ears with his hands. He used an old dropper to give them water with sugar and salt, then spoon-fed them soft mashed pumpkin and bits of softened kibble. The smallest one, barely breathing, he kept tucked against his chest inside his flannel. Its heartbeat was faint, but it was there. "You're not going yet," he murmured. "Not while I've got breath in me." Walter stayed up the entire night. He watched the storm beat against the windows, the frost clawing at the edges, while beside him, 6 battered souls slowly began to warm. One let out a weak bark. Another whimpered in its sleep. Their breathing evened, and the tiny golden bodies curled closer together. By dawn, he had named them. Not names he said aloud, just thoughts. The one with the crooked paw he called Rusty. The smallest, the one against his chest, he called hope. The fire had dimmed to a soft red glow by morning, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls of Walter's cabin. The wind had died down outside, but snow still blanketed Everpine in thick, undisturbed sheets. Inside, Walter Hayes sat on the floor, his back resting against the leg of his armchair, eyes heavy from exhaustion but refusing to close. In his arms lay the smallest of the 6 puppies, still wrapped in a flannel towel, its tiny breath shallow and slow. He hadn't moved from that position in hours, afraid the fragile life against his chest might slip away if he looked away for even a moment. Around him, the other 5 puppies were curled together in a nest of old sweaters and blankets near the fire. One had a twitch in its left leg, another snored with a faint rasp, but they were alive. Walter had cleaned each one with damp cloths, checking for wounds, infections, frostbite. Several had gashes that looked like they came from wire or sharp tools. Their bellies were still bloated and their bodies far too thin, their fur sticky and dull. But they were warm now and fed, and for the first time in who knows how long, they were safe. Walter leaned his head back and closed his eyes. His body ached from the cold and strain, but there was a strange peace in his chest. He didn't know why those puppies were left to die, but he knew this. They weren't going to die in his care. A sharp knock startled him upright. It came again, 3 quick taps, insistent but not hostile. Walter gently tucked the puppy into the nest with its siblings and moved to the door. He cracked it open, squinting into the morning light. "Walter, it's Diane. I saw your light on all night." Standing in the snow was a woman in a red parka, her breath misting the air. Diane Morley, 34 years old, was Walter's nearest neighbor, though nearest in Everpine still meant a 5-minute walk through snow-covered paths. Tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and long dark hair usually tied back in a braid, Diane carried herself with the calm precision of someone trained to handle emergencies. She worked as a veterinary nurse at the Everpine Animal Wellness Clinic, where she was known for her quiet intensity and firm sense of right and wrong. Diane had moved to town 6 years ago after losing her fiancé in a skiing accident, and since then had poured her life into animal care, rarely socializing, but always responding when needed. Walter opened the door wider. "Come in." Diane stepped inside and immediately froze at the sight of the puppies. Her eyes widened and her breath caught. "Oh my God," she whispered, dropping to her knees. She reached out, gently brushing a trembling pup with her fingers. "Walter, where did you find them?" "Behind the trees past the shed," he said, voice low. "Someone dumped them in a burlap sack, left them to die in the storm." Diane shook her head slowly. "They're golden retrievers, barely 4 weeks old." She examined one with practiced hands. This one's ear was sliced, probably with a blade. And look, this belly isn't just bloated from hunger. There's intestinal distress. They've been kept in filth. Her voice turned sharp. "This isn't someone getting rid of puppies. This is organized, industrial." Walter nodded. "I thought so too, but they're breathing, barely." Diane stood, eyes burning. "We need to report this. If this is part of a ring—" "No." Walter's voice was firmer than usual. He ran a hand down his beard, eyes shadowed. "Not yet." She blinked. "What?" "They dumped them here, which means they know this place. If we make noise too early, whoever did this might come back and finish the job. Or worse. I want to know who they are before we involve anyone." Diane crossed her arms. "Walter, this isn't a game. These dogs were tortured. Whoever did this isn't going to just walk away." He looked at her steadily. "You think I don't know that?" Silence passed between them. Then Diane exhaled, softening. "All right. But we're watching them together. And if anything happens, anything, I call the sheriff." Walter nodded. Over the next few hours, the two of them worked side by side. Diane brought a small medical kit from home, antiseptic, gauze, syringes, a thermometer. She moved with quiet confidence, cleaning wounds and checking temperatures, while Walter warmed milk and mashed rice with boiled chicken. One of the puppies, a slightly larger male with honey-colored fur and a scar across his snout, had a fever and shallow breathing. Diane frowned. "He needs fluids, badly." She found a tiny vein and inserted a makeshift IV drip from a bottle and tubing. Walter watched, nervous but grateful. As they worked, Diane asked, "Do they have names?" Walter hesitated, then said, "In my head, yeah, that little one's Hope." He nodded toward the pup that had slept against his chest. "The one with the scar I've been calling Rusty." Diane smiled faintly. "Hope and Rusty. Not bad." The sky outside began to shift to dusk, the soft blue light fading into gray. Diane brewed tea in the corner while Walter stoked the fire. There was no need for words between them. In that quiet, they became a unit. Two wounded people brought together by 6 even more fragile lives. That night, Diane didn't go home. She slept in the armchair, wrapped in a blanket, a notebook in her lap filled with notes on dosages and feedings. Walter stayed on the floor, one hand resting on the edge of the blanket where the puppies lay. In the silence, amidst the faint crackle of the fire and the slow, even breaths of sleeping animals, Walter whispered, "They're not just dogs. They're a message. Someone out there doesn't care if things suffer. But I do. We do." Diane didn't answer, but she nodded, eyes closed, tears just beginning to form at the corners. 3 days after the storm had quieted, the snow around Everpine began to soften, revealing bits of a world hidden beneath the white. The morning was bitter but clear, sun peeking through gray clouds as water dripped slowly from rooftops and branches. Walter Hayes stood at the edge of the woods behind his cabin, bundled in his thick canvas coat, a scarf tucked into his collar, and a pair of old binoculars slung over one shoulder. Diane Morley followed a few steps behind, her notebook in hand, boots crunching in slushy ice. "Over here," Walter said, pointing with his gloved hand to a patch of disturbed snow near a fallen pine. The ground was still crusted in ice, but the signs were there. Deep indentations, unmistakable as tire tracks. Narrow, single-wheeled, the kind made by a small delivery truck or utility van. Several feet away, a trail of heavy boot prints zigzagged toward the trees and abruptly stopped where Walter had first found the sack. Diane crouched and pulled a plastic evidence bag from her coat pocket. In it, she placed a weather-stained glove, brown leather with a tear across the knuckles and a dried streak of what looked like blood. Her expression tightened. This wasn't just someone getting rid of puppies. They came prepared, and they weren't careful. Walter's face was grim. They thought no one would ever look. Back at the cabin, the puppies were bundled in an improvised playpen near the stove, warm, fed, and starting to wobble on their feet. Walter checked on them every 20 minutes, and Diane had begun charting their weight and appetite in her notebook. But this morning, she had also brought a name. "Rachel Wynne," Diane said as they poured coffee into tin mugs by the fire. "She's a reporter. Freelance now. Used to cover illegal breeding operations for a Denver paper. She's the one who broke the story about the abandoned pit bull kennels in Copper Valley last year." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You trust her?" Diane nodded. "She's good, smart, doesn't chase headlines. She chases the truth." Rachel arrived that evening just before dusk, her small Subaru kicking up a spray of slush as it turned into Walter's gravel driveway. She was 28, short and wiry, with a tangle of dark curls pulled into a messy bun, oversized coat zipped up to her chin, and a DSLR camera slung diagonally across her chest. She had the quick movements and sharp eyes of someone who'd grown used to arriving in uncomfortable places and asking uncomfortable questions. "Walter Hayes," she greeted, stepping out of the car and wiping snow from her boots. "That's me. I'm Rachel. Diane sent me. I brought puppy food, blankets, and a full battery." She wasted no time. Once inside, she dropped to her knees in front of the pen. "Oh, God," she whispered, eyes wide. "They're so small." "They were smaller when I found them," Walter said softly. Rachel set up her camera. "Do you mind?" "No flash," Diane added quickly. "They're still sensitive to light." Rachel nodded and began to work. She moved carefully, photographing each puppy, documenting every wound and scar. She asked questions without being intrusive. Where were they found? What time? How did Walter notice the sounds? What steps had been taken? She recorded some of it on a small audio device clipped to her coat, her tone professional, but weighted with emotion. Once finished, Rachel sat with them at the kitchen table. "This needs to be public," she said. "People don't just abandon puppies like this without a reason. There's always a pattern, profit, cruelty, or both. I can publish the story tonight. No names or locations unless you agree." Walter hesitated, glancing toward the puppies. "And what happens if the wrong person sees it?" Rachel was quiet a moment. "Or the right one does." Walter nodded slowly. "Do it." That night, Rachel uploaded the photos and wrote the article. She titled it, "Buried in Snow, Saved by Grace, 6 Golden Souls Found on the Brink of Death." She didn't mention Everpine. She simply called it a mountain town in Colorado. Within hours, the story was being shared across social media. Comments poured in, outrage, offers to help, donations. The photos, especially the one of Rusty curled against Hope, spread fast. Rachel stayed the night in a sleeping bag on the cabin floor. Diane returned home to check on her cat, but promised to return at dawn. Walter, feeling an unease he couldn't name, sat awake by the fire long after the others had gone to bed. Sometime around 2 a.m., headlights cut across the snow in front of the house. A low, humming engine paused just beyond the trees. Walter moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside with calloused fingers. A dark truck idled on the road. No logo, no plates visible in the dark. The engine revved once, then shut off. A long pause followed. Then, just as quietly as it had come, the truck backed away and disappeared. Morning light revealed a chilling sight. On the wooden fence near the shed, scrawled in thick red marker, were the words, "Stay out of things that don't concern you." Rachel took a photo immediately. Diane called the sheriff, but didn't file a report. Walter insisted on waiting. He stood outside for nearly an hour that morning, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes on the woods. "I thought I left the darkness behind when I quit that place," he murmured, "but it's still watching." The morning sun crept shyly over Everpine, casting a pale light on the melting snow that blanketed the hills like a faded memory. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the snow itself. Inside the cabin, Walter Hayes stood by the fireplace, staring at the map he'd unearthed from his storage chest just an hour ago. The paper was brittle, its creases deep like the wrinkles in his own hands, and the ink was faded, but the lines were clear enough to remember where they led. There, just beyond Mill Creek and past the split in the logging road, was a patch of land labeled only as Lot 49. Walter traced it with his finger, jaw tight. "Travis Munn," he murmured. Diane looked up from the pen where the puppies lay curled and drowsy. "What did you say?" "That cabin in the woods," Walter replied, turning to face her. "Lot 49 used to be leased out to a man named Travis Munn. Lived there for a few years back when I was working night security at the old mill. Everyone kept their distance. Mean son of a gun. There were rumors, dogfighting, illegal breeding, bad things, but no one ever caught him doing anything." Rachel, sitting at the small dining table with her laptop, perked up. "You think he's behind this?" Walter didn't answer right away. He simply tapped the spot on the map. "That place always smelled like death. I think we need to go see it." They prepared quickly. Walter grabbed his heavy coat and a flashlight, slipping a crowbar into a canvas duffel. Diane packed medical supplies and a small camera of her own. Rachel, moving with her typical quick efficiency, slung her DSLR over her shoulder and zipped up a waterproof field jacket that dwarfed her frame. The hike was cold and quiet, the crunch of wet snow beneath their boots the only sound. The forest deepened as they climbed, the trees crowding tighter together, their branches heavy with melt. The path, though overgrown, still followed the remnants of an old logging road, the terrain turning steeper and darker with every step. By midday, the cabin came into view. It sat in a clearing choked with thorn brush and rusted fencing, its roof sagging, one shutter hanging askew. The wood was grayed and splintered, moss clinging to its edges. A faint metallic smell hung in the air, something foul and artificial beneath the rot. Rachel pulled out her camera, but paused. "This place looks like it's been abandoned for years." Walter stepped forward, lifting his crowbar. The front door creaked open under minimal force, revealing a dim interior soaked in shadows. The smell hit them instantly, acrid, ammonia-like, with a thick undercurrent of decay. They moved cautiously. The main room was cluttered with broken furniture, old tools, and piles of shredded newspaper. Along one wall stood a row of rusted metal cages, some twisted and bent as if kicked or forced open. Straw littered the floor. Flecks of fur clung to the cage bars. Diane crouched and pointed toward a pile in the corner. This was a whelping area. You can tell by the shredded rags and the stains. Rachel began taking pictures. Wide shots first, then details. Scratch marks on the floor, broken water bowls, a wall covered in peeling paint with a crooked sign above it. Forever Friends Breeding Company. The image of a cartoon dog with a halo was smeared and torn down the middle. In a pile of old supplies, Walter kicked something metal by accident. He reached down and pulled it out. A small red collar, frayed at one end, with a faded metal tag attached. Diane took it and wiped the grime away with her glove. The tag read, #042A, no name, no address. "There's blood on this," she said softly, holding it beneath the beam of her flashlight. "It hasn't been here long." Walter stared at the tag, his throat tight. "That number? I don't know what it means, but I'd bet my life that belonged to one of the pups we're caring for now." Rachel, who had crouched to examine the cages, looked up. This place wasn't just abandoned, it was vacated. Recently. Diane walked to a moldy filing cabinet wedged in the corner. Inside were manila folders marked only with numbers. She flipped one open. Printed forms with weight logs, breed types, and handwritten scribbles. "All fake," she muttered. "No real vet would sign off on this." Rachel photographed every page. "We can give all of this to Louisa Dent at the State Animal Welfare Office. She was part of the bust in Fort Garland last year. If anyone will act, it's her." They gathered what they could. Rachel rolled the sign up carefully, placing it inside her pack. Diane kept two of the more detailed folders. Walter, before leaving, stood for a long moment in front of the cages. "No animal should ever live in a place like this," he said, "and no man who built it deserves to walk free." As they trekked back down the ridge, the wind picked up again, rustling the trees like whispers. By the time they reached the cabin, the snow had started to fall again, thin and steady. The puppies stirred as Walter walked in, tails wagging weakly. Rachel uploaded the files to a secure folder and sent them to her contact. Walter sat beside the pen, watching as one of the larger pups gnawed at a scrap of blanket. The red collar sat beside him on the table, its metal tag glinting faintly in the firelight. The days grew a little longer in Everpine, though the snow remained thick along the cabin's eaves. The silence that once weighed on the house now carried warmth. Inside, the scent of boiling chicken and chamomile filled the air as Walter stirred a pot, while Diane knelt by the growing puppies, gently brushing bits of dried fur from Rusty's back. The smallest pup, Hope, was beginning to take slow steps now, her once dull eyes alert to movement, her ribs less visible under the softening curve of her belly. But not all was well. One of the larger pups, a male with a faint streak of white down his nose, had begun acting strangely. He'd been the most alert at first, but now flinched at sudden light and whimpered when the sound of a truck engine echoed through the hills. The first time it happened, Walter was chopping firewood. The pup froze, dropped his tail, and let out a long, low whine, then bolted under the table. Since then, even the rumble of Rachel's old Subaru made him tremble. Walter watched closely. "They saw something, Diane. Something they weren't supposed to." Diane nodded grimly. "This isn't just trauma. It's memory." That night, Walter couldn't sleep. He sat in his old recliner, a blanket across his legs, eyes scanning the snowy window panes. Rachel had returned to Denver to prepare her next article, and Diane had gone home briefly to rest. The cabin felt different. Still, but not peaceful. Like something watching had finally decided to move. It was near midnight when he heard the noise, soft, deliberate, a crunch in the snow outside, then another, then silence. Walter stood slowly, heart thumping. He moved toward the back door, flicked off the inside lights, and peeked through the curtains. At first, he saw nothing. But then, movement. A figure in dark clothing crouched by the fence near the woodshed, moving low and slow, like a predator. He grabbed his old shotgun from the hooks above the door, not loaded, but enough to scare, and switched on the floodlight. The man bolted. Walter threw the door open and shouted, "Stop!" But the figure darted through the trees. Walter called 911 with shaking hands. The Everpine Sheriff's deputy arrived in less than 20 minutes. The man they found hiding behind a half-buried trailer 2 properties down was tall, wiry, and filthy, with grease-streaked jeans and a jacket patched with roofing tar. His name was Zane Lutter, 41, a former construction worker known around town for odd jobs and even odder habits. He had a history of trespassing and once got caught stealing veterinary-grade painkillers from a barn. Deputy Owens, a stocky, no-nonsense man with gray hair and a habit of chewing gum loudly, pulled Walter aside after searching Zane's bag. He had wire cutters, a syringe with no label, and 6 feet of nylon rope. Not the kind of gear you bring to borrow sugar. Walter clenched his jaw. Ask him who sent him. Zane didn't resist arrest. Inside the back of the patrol SUV, he sat with his arms slack, eyes glazed with the kind of hollow disinterest only found in men who had seen too much and cared too little. But when questioned, he cracked faster than expected. He told us everything, Owen said the next morning, sipping coffee at Walter's kitchen table. He was sent to retrieve the puppies, or get rid of them. His words. Diane looked up sharply. By who? A man named Travis Munn, Owens answered, still off-grid. But Zane says Munn's been breeding dogs illegally for years. Sells litters to buyers overseas, Eastern Europe, China. High demand for purebreds. Doesn't care how he gets them or what condition they're in. Walter stood silent, a hand resting on the edge of the puppy pen. Hope had fallen asleep, head tucked under Rusty's leg. The pup who feared trucks was curled beside them, still trembling in his sleep. Owens continued. Zane was promised cash. Said he didn't know the pups were alive until he saw the news story. Munn told him to clean it up. I think he got scared halfway through the job. Diane muttered, he should be. The deputy exhaled. I'll push the DA. Zane's testimony could crack this open statewide, but we'll need more. Walter turned to the window, eyes scanning the gray woods beyond. You'll have it. The snow had returned to Everpine by the time the raid was ready. This time, it came not with silence, but with sirens, boot prints, and the unmistakable echo of law finally waking from its slumber. The morning sky was iron gray as a convoy of unmarked black SUVs and 2 county cruisers turned off the main road and disappeared into the trees leading toward Lot 49. Walter Hayes stood behind a split-rail fence on a neighboring ridge, binoculars steady in his gloved hands. Diane stood beside him, her lips pressed tight, arms crossed against the wind. Down in the clearing below, officers in tactical vests fanned out around the dilapidated cabin, their movements swift and silent. The lead among them, a woman in her early 50s named Inspector Louisa Dent, signaled a 2-man unit to circle the back. Louisa was a legend among Colorado's animal welfare enforcement community. Tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray in her thick black braid. Her face bore the unshakable calm of someone who had seen more than she ever wished to, and had chosen not to look away. Dressed in plain jeans, a padded vest, and snow boots, she looked more like a school principal than a field enforcer, until you saw her eyes. Cold, precise, and impossible to mislead. Moments later, a voice rang out. Clear! Followed by a grim, we've got movement in the kennel. They found them in the back structure behind the main cabin, a converted barn with rusted locks and industrial heat lamps humming overhead. Inside, 29 dogs of varying size and breed cowered in cramped cages. German shepherds, Labradors, golden retrievers, a few terriers, and 1 large female Rottweiler with ribs poking out from under her torn coat. The smell of ammonia and feces was overwhelming, even in the open air. Several dogs limped. One had no ear. Another was missing a paw and lay curled in a corner. Travis Munn stood in the middle of it all, arms crossed, jaw clenched. He wore a brown canvas coat stained with oil and mud, and his face, narrow, leathery, with sunken eyes, twisted into a mockery of indifference as the officers closed in. Walter watched from the ridge, breath catching. That's him? Diane glanced over. You sure? Walter nodded slowly. He hasn't changed. They had crossed paths once, 6 years ago, when Walter worked night patrol for a contractor, supplying fencing for Munn's supposed breeding station. Walter had noticed the cries, the strange deliveries, the bloody straw tossed in a burn pit. He had asked questions. Munn hadn't liked that. Within 2 weeks, Walter had been accused of theft, fired, and blacklisted quietly across multiple contracts. Inside the barn, Louisa Dent read Travis his rights while 2 officers cuffed him, his lip curled into a grin. You'll have nothing to pin, he said. You left plenty, she replied calmly, nodding toward the crates, and 6 witnesses you didn't count on surviving. That afternoon, the rescued dogs were transported in coordinated waves to regional shelters and emergency clinics. Diane volunteered to ride with the first truck, helping stabilize a German shepherd with frostbite and guiding a terrier with 2 broken legs into a crate padded with towels. Rachel Wynn returned to Everpine that same evening, her cheeks flushed red from cold and excitement. She rushed into Walter's cabin carrying her laptop, camera bag, and a thermos of cider. "It's happening," she said, eyes alight. "Statewide movement. My article's been reshared over 10,000 times. I've been getting calls from newsrooms, foundations, even a senator's aide. We're launching a new platform, rescue database, adoption resources, legal petitions. It's all coming together." Walter smiled faintly, pouring her a mug, and all from a cry in the woods. Rachel sat cross-legged near the fire, uploading more footage while the puppies played beside her. The one who once feared trucks now chased a cloth shoe with clumsy hops. Hope, stronger than ever, gnawed on the edge of Diane's old scarf. Rusty barked when someone sneezed. 2 weeks later, decisions were made. Diane, after long nights of wrestling with uncertainty, filled out the adoption forms for 2 of the puppies, Rusty and the shy female she called Olive. She had cleared out her small guest room and converted it into a play den, already stocked with chew toys and calming diffusers. "I thought I couldn't handle more love in my house," she told Walter one morning. "But these 2, they taught me I had more room than I knew." Walter chose to keep Hope and the wide-eyed pup with the crooked tail. The house, once silent for years, now echoed with playful yelps and the tap of small paws on hardwood floors. He woke early not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And for the first time since his wife passed, he sang while chopping wood. The remaining 2 pups, now stronger, rounder, their fur golden and clean, were adopted by 2 families who had seen Rachel's story online. One couple from Boulder drove 6 hours in the snow. Another woman, a retired school teacher from Fort Collins, brought a bag of homemade treats and wept when she first held the tiny male pup in her arms. Spring came late to Everpine. The snow didn't vanish all at once. It melted reluctantly, in hesitant drips from the roofs, in slow streams trickling down frozen gutters, in soft, wet patches on the forest floor where new grass peeked like shy children. But with it came color, wildflowers daring to bloom again, birdsong that returned in hesitant verses, and a town that began to smile a little more easily. Exactly 1 month after the raid on Lot 49, the people of Everpine gathered at Brookside Park, the town's largest green space nestled between a maple grove and a lazy stream. The sky was an open canvas of blue, and sunlight painted everything in warmth. Wooden booths lined the path, decorated with banners and handmade signs. At the center of it all stood a large hand-painted board, Rescue Day, celebrating hope, humanity, and 6 golden miracles. Rachel Wynn had coordinated the event with a small team of volunteers she recruited from across the state, students, nurses, dog lovers, and 1 retired K-9 officer who had driven 3 hours to attend. Dressed in jeans and a sunflower yellow hoodie, Rachel flitted between booths, camera in hand, smile unstoppable. She'd barely slept in the past week, finalizing her manuscript, managing the story's national reach, and preparing to launch her book, From the Melting Snow, 6 Hearts, 1 Chance. At the edge of the park stood a wooden platform, and beside it, a simple wooden chair, the guest of honor's seat. Walter Hayes, now a known name in Everpine and beyond, stood beside it, squinting at the gathering crowd. He wore a neatly pressed flannel shirt, clean denim jeans, and a wool cap that Diane had insisted he not leave behind. His once weary face held a softness now, his eyes more open, his smile less reluctant. In his arms sat Hope, now stronger, her coat rich gold and eyes bright. River, the floppy-tailed pup with a love for chasing shadows, circled his boots eagerly. A woman approached him from the crowd, a petite blonde in her early 60s with round glasses and a t-shirt that read, "Dogs are family." She carried a leash at her side, and attached to it one of the 6 puppies, now nearly double in size and happily sniffing the grass. "You must be Mr. Hayes," she said with a warm voice. "This one changed my life." Walter smiled and gave a small nod. "He changed mine, too." Across the field, Diane stood by a shaded picnic table, speaking with 2 young boys who were feeding treats to Rusty and Olive, the 2 pups she had adopted. Diane wore a soft green blouse and dark jeans, her hair looser than usual, falling over her shoulder in soft waves. She was laughing, an easy, light sound Walter hadn't heard from her before. Since the day she brought those two dogs home, she had volunteered at a local shelter every weekend, training new pet owners and leading early morning walks through town. Rachel stepped onto the stage just after noon, taking the mic with a modest wave. "I didn't plan to talk," she began, "but someone reminded me this morning that stories, like the lives we save, deserve to be told out loud." She went on to share the journey, from a snowstorm and a whisper in the woods, to a cabin full of scars and courage, to justice brought under frozen trees, and now to a community transformed. She thanked the sheriff's department, Louisa Dent, the rescue foundations, the countless donors, and finally, she turned toward Walter, Diane, and the pups. "But most of all," she said, her voice catching slightly, "thank you to those who didn't turn away, who listened when the world was quiet, who followed a cry no one else heard." The crowd stood in applause. Later that evening, after the booths were packed, the guests had trickled home, and the sun had begun its descent behind the hills, Walter returned to his porch. The cabin was warm now, its porch freshly swept, and flower pots hanging from the eaves. Children had been there earlier, laughing, tumbling over themselves as they played with the puppies. Walter had sat in his old rocking chair, reading aloud the story of brave Baxter, the dog who crossed the desert to find his way home. "Story Hour with Uncle Walter," they called it now. He sat again that night, blanket across his lap, Hope curled beside him, River lying at his feet with his head resting on the top step. In the distance, a single owl hooted, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Walter looked up at the stars beginning to shimmer above the treetops, then down at the little golden body nestled beside him. He took a breath, deep and full. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, voice raspy with gratitude, "for giving me one more reason to stay." Sometimes the smallest lives teach us the greatest lessons. A cry in the snow, a man who chose to listen, and 6 fragile hearts that reminded a town how to feel again. We all face moments where we can walk away, or lean in with compassion. Not every cry is loud. Not every soul in pain can speak. But when we choose kindness, we create a world where healing becomes possible. Maybe today, you'll notice something you used to ignore. A neighbor in need, a stray without shelter, a friend hiding behind silence. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment to tell us what part moved you most. And if you believe that every act of love matters, type Amen in the comments to help this message reach more hearts. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that inspire, and may God bless you and everyone who still chooses to care. A German shepherd sits alone behind the rusted gates of an animal shelter. His eyes don't move, his ears don't twitch. Not even when the man he once trusted kneels in front of him, whispering his name. He doesn't recognize him. But when the sirens scream, when the boy screams, the dog moves. Why would a dog forget his own handler? And what happens when he starts to remember? Don't skip this one. What this dog chooses to do will break you and rebuild you. The city of Redbridge always seemed to exhale in the early evening, its skyline flickering against a burnt orange sky, the hum of traffic softening as the world prepared to retreat. But for Eli Whitaker, peace never came with dusk. The porch of his narrow brick house creaked under the weight of silence as he stood staring at the message on his phone, brief, clinical, and yet quietly devastating. Subject ID hash K90248 identified. German Shepherd, verified via microchip. Records match, Atlas. Eli's hand tightened around the phone. The name alone brought the heat back to his chest, the throb of adrenaline, the scent of sand and sweat and gunpowder. But that life was a ghost now, and Atlas was part of a chapter he'd never dared reopen. Still, something in him moved. Eli was a man in his early 40s with the kind of weathered face that made people hesitate to ask questions. His eyes, steel gray, always scanning, carried the weight of loss too heavy for most to recognize. A jagged scar ran along his left temple, mostly hidden by a few loose strands of hair turned silver too soon. His walk carried a subtle limp, the aftermath of a shattered femur never fully healed, and he wore layers even in spring, as if trying to armor himself from the world. He didn't talk much, didn't go out often. The house he lived in was a modest 2-story with a fading green shutters and a porch light that rarely worked. It had been 3 years since his last mission, 3 years since the night everything turned to fire and screams and silence, since Atlas vanished. The next morning, Eli drove across the city to the edge of the industrial district, where the Redbridge Rescue Center stood like a forgotten warehouse wedged between gray walls and chain fences. He hadn't set foot in a shelter since he'd left the service. He hated the smell, disinfectant and despair, and the chorus of barking that always seemed to echo grief. Dr. Nadia Wells met him at the gate. She was a woman in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm voice that came from years of seeing animals in all stages of suffering. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose bun, and she wore a navy fleece over her scrubs, both covered in traces of fur. She offered a curt nod instead of a smile. "You're Eli Whitaker?" she asked. Her voice had no judgment, only quiet efficiency. "Yes," he said. "You said the dog might be mine." She nodded and led him toward the back of the facility, past rows of kennels where dogs barked and clawed, eager or desperate or both. But one kennel at the end was silent. "He's different," Nadia said softly. "We found him wandering near the train yard. No aggression, but won't eat if people are around. Doesn't sleep much. Doesn't respond to anyone. He's been moved between 3 shelters. There are signs he was trained, military style, but also..." She paused, then looked at Eli. Signs he might have been retrained. Badly. When they reached the last kennel, Eli felt his breath catch. There, curled in the corner like a statue carved from shadow and memory, was a large German shepherd. His coat was once a proud mix of black and tan, but now dulled by grime and neglect. His ears stood alert, but his posture was sunken, as if he no longer believed in the purpose of his own body, and his eyes, dark, clouded, distant, held none of the fire Eli remembered. "Atlas," Eli whispered. The shepherd lifted his head slowly at the sound. Their eyes met. No reaction. No spark of recognition. Just the faint twitch of an ear before the dog looked away again. Eli stepped closer. "It's me, partner," he said, barely breathing the words. Atlas stared past him. His throat tightened. The ache in his chest felt worse than any gunshot wound. "He doesn't know me," he murmured. Nadia placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "But something brought you here, Mr. Whitaker. Maybe he just needs time." Eli stood there for a long time, silently watching the creature he once trusted with his life. He finally nodded. "I'll take him." That evening, when Eli returned to his quiet house in the old district, the neighborhood lights flickered in early spring wind. From the second-story window across the street, Marley Quinn watched him from behind her curtains. She was in her mid-30s, slim, with shoulder-length auburn curls always tied in a messy knot. Her soft brown eyes hid behind large glasses, and her wardrobe was a mix of oversized cardigans and paint-stained jeans. Marley taught therapeutic art classes for children with trauma and developmental disorders. Kindness seemed to emanate from her, though she had learned not to expect it in return, especially not from Eli. She had once brought over cookies, and once tried to make conversation when his porch railing broke in a storm. Each time, he had turned her away with a quiet but unmistakable wall in his voice. Yet still, she lingered by her window. Something about the man, the way he limped, the way he never smiled, pulled at her. That evening, when she saw him leading a large dog into his house, her heart leapt with cautious hope. She whispered to herself, "So he's finally letting someone in." That night, long after the streets of Redbridge had quieted, Eli sat on the floor of his dim living room, watching Atlas curled in the farthest corner. The dog hadn't moved much since they got home. He refused food, drank little, and wouldn't make eye contact. Eli didn't speak either. There was nothing to say that could undo the years between them. At some point near midnight, Eli rose to lock the front door, and found something wedged beneath the welcome mat. A single folded note. The paper was damp from the dew, but the ink was bold. "Don't look for the past. Some things are better lost." No name, no address, no explanation. Eli stood for a long moment under the porch light, the paper shaking slightly in his hand. Behind him, Atlas stirred, his ears flicking toward the door, as if he sensed something that Eli couldn't. Inside the house, the lights flickered, and Eli, for the first time in 3 years, felt something worse than silence creeping in. The morning after bringing Atlas home felt heavier than most. The light filtering through Eli's blinds cast long, cold streaks across the wooden floor, and in the corner of the living room, the German Shepherd lay stiffly on a folded blanket. His ears were alert, eyes half open but unfocused, tracking nothing and no one. It had been a silent night. Atlas hadn't made a sound, nor had he moved. Eli had left the bedroom door ajar in case the dog decided to venture closer, but he never did. Eli watched him from the kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug warming his calloused hands. He wasn't expecting miracles, but he had hoped for something, anything, that hinted at a spark buried beneath that haunted gaze. The scars on Atlas's muzzle were more visible now in daylight. Thin, white lines slashing through his fur, a silent testament to struggle. One ear had a slight tear, healed long ago but jagged at the edge. His coat, though cleaned at the shelter, still held the dullness of weeks without proper care. He was large, even for a German Shepherd, with thick shoulders and a barrel chest that once exuded strength, but now seemed built more from memory than muscle. Eli leaned back and exhaled. He'd faced down ambushes, cleared bunkers, and led raids through bombed-out streets. But this, sitting in his own home across from a creature who used to be family, was something else entirely. He reached into a drawer beside the table and pulled out an old leash, military-grade faded olive green with fraying near the clasp. He clipped it gently to Atlas's collar. The dog didn't flinch, but his body tensed, as if preparing for a command that never came. They stepped outside into the weak spring sunlight. Redbridge was waking up. Cars honked in the distance, a garbage truck clanged at the curb, and two boys on scooters raced down the street. Atlas didn't look at any of it. He walked beside Eli with mechanical obedience, steps precise, but his eyes remained elsewhere. When a passing siren wailed a few blocks away, a shrill, rising scream of an ambulance, Atlas stopped dead. His body jerked violently. Then came the gurgled growl, low and primal. He lunged sideways toward the brick wall of Eli's front porch and slammed his head against it. Once, twice, until Eli shouted his name. "Atlas!" The shepherd froze, breath heaving, chest rising and falling like a trapped beast. Eli dropped the leash and crouched, speaking low. "You're okay. You're not there. You're here. With me." Atlas backed away, stumbling slightly, then curled his body into the corner by the fence, pressing against it like he wanted to disappear. A line of blood trickled from a scrape near his brow. From across the street, Marley Quinn saw it all. She was standing on her own porch, one hand clutching a mug of tea, the other curled anxiously at her side. She wore a long gray cardigan over a floral blouse and jeans, and her curls were tied up in a red scarf that fluttered in the morning breeze. Marley had a softness to her, a kind of emotional fluency that made her a refuge for children too quiet for the world. But now, her face was pinched with concern. Without hesitation, she walked toward them. "He's reacting to the siren?" she asked, eyes flicking from Atlas's wound to Eli's expression. "He's stuck in something," Eli replied, not bothering to mask the frustration in his voice. "Some loop I can't break through." "You should take him to Dr. Carr's center," she said, keeping her tone gentle. "They do trauma work with XK9 units, PTSD desensitization, scent therapy, slow stuff, but it's helped some of my kids when they have worked with dogs." Eli didn't answer at first. His hand hovered near Atlas, but never touched. "He doesn't even want to be touched," he muttered. "Then let him see that you're still here," Marley said, soft and firm at once. "That's how it starts." Before Eli could respond, her phone buzzed. She looked at it briefly and her brows drew together. "Damn, I have to go. Mason's foster mom just got taken to urgent care. Kidney failure. I was supposed to meet them at the community center." "Mason?" Eli asked. "He's one of my students," she explained quickly. "Autistic. 9 years old. He doesn't do well with unexpected change." She looked around, eyes searching. Could you take him home? Just until I figure something out? His usual caseworker's out of town." Eli hesitated. Marley saw the resistance build in his face like a wall rising brick by brick. But then he glanced at Atlas, who was slowly lowering his head to the ground, still trembling. "Okay," Eli said, surprising them both. "Bring him." 20 minutes later, Marley arrived with Mason in the back seat of her car. The boy was small for his age, wiry with dark, straight hair that hung over his eyes. He wore a navy hoodie with the sleeves pulled over his hands and clutched a well-worn sketch pad to his chest. He didn't speak as he stepped out, but his gaze roamed the yard with hawk-like focus. When he saw Atlas, he paused mid-step. Atlas, who had remained immobile in the corner of the porch, lifted his head at the same moment. The boy and the dog locked eyes. Something passed between them. Not recognition, not exactly, but an awareness, like two beings sensing the same storm behind the other's eyes. Mason approached slowly, not looking at Eli or Marley. When he stood a few feet from Atlas, he crouched and opened his sketch pad, revealing pages filled with pencil drawings, mostly buildings, all empty, some crumbling, and dogs. Always dogs, drawn in silhouette, watching from doorways or lying beneath broken trees. Eli watched, unmoving. Mason's fingers brushed the page as he whispered without looking up, "This one's you." He turned the sketch pad toward Atlas, showing a picture of a German shepherd drawn in the center of a street. Everything else was fading around him, buildings dissolving, lampposts bending. Only the dog remained whole. Eli walked to the car, popped the trunk, and retrieved a folded blanket and an old duffel. As he moved things around, something slipped free, a small, dented metal object. Atlas's military service medal, a bronze star embedded in a faded leather strap. Mason walked over, reached down, and picked it up before Eli could react. He turned it over in his hands, fingers tracing the engraved letters. "Why is this so sad?" he asked. Eli couldn't answer. Mason looked back at Atlas. "This dog remembers something he doesn't want to. I do too." The sun dipped lower behind the buildings of Redbridge, casting long shadows across the yard. For a brief moment, Eli thought he saw Atlas shift. Not away, but forward, just an inch. His eyes were still wary, still distant. But now, they were watching something. Someone. The next morning, the sky hung low over Redbridge like a thick sheet of steel. It hadn't rained, but the light carried that peculiar weight that made everything feel like a prelude. Eli stood in the hallway of his home, fingers curled around a small object he hadn't touched in years. A slim military whistle, worn smooth at the edges from use, still threaded with the original olive green cord. He stared at it for a long time before stepping into the living room, where Atlas lay sprawled on the floorboards with his back to the doorway, still alert even in stillness. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock. Eli took a step forward and blew the whistle once, sharp and quick, the same frequency he used to use to signal Atlas during close-range reconnaissance drills. At first, there was nothing. Then Atlas's ears twitched. A second whistle, slightly longer, cut through the air. Atlas bolted up. His eyes snapped toward Eli, and in that instant, the shepherd surged forward. Eli didn't move. The dog's body language wasn't clear. It wasn't playful nor overtly aggressive. It was fast, driven. Atlas's paws hit the floor in heavy thuds until he reached within a yard of Eli, then stopped. His entire body quivered, hackles raised, and his breath came in short, erratic bursts. Eli saw the whites of his eyes, saw the confusion, the panic, the fight behind the hesitation, and then Atlas collapsed. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. His legs gave way and he crumpled to the floor, whimpering, his massive frame shaking as if his mind had short-circuited. Eli slowly lowered the whistle, his breath tight in his chest. He crouched beside the trembling shepherd, keeping his hands low and open. "You don't have to remember it all at once," he said softly. He didn't expect a response, but Atlas didn't back away. Later that afternoon, Marley arrived with Mason. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, and her hands were smudged with blue and yellow pastel dust. Mason walked a few paces behind her, hood pulled over his head, hands clutching a sketchbook to his chest. Marley gave Eli a small nod. "We brought supplies. I thought maybe Mason could draw in a new space. Might help." Eli gestured them inside, and they made their way to the back room, where a large floor mirror leaned against the wall, left over from the previous homeowner. The moment Atlas stepped in and saw it, something inside him shifted. At first he only paused, his eyes narrowed, then his ears pinned back. The shepherd crept toward the mirror slowly, cautiously. Then, without warning, he lunged forward, barking violently. His reflection responded in perfect tandem. Atlas growled, his body rigid, tail stiff and low. He snapped at the glass once, twice, then backed away sharply. His gaze dropped as he turned and fled from the room, tail tucked, body trembling. Eli found him moments later hiding behind the armchair in the living room, his breath coming in sharp wheezes, eyes darting toward the hallway like the mirror had followed him. He didn't move even when Eli sat nearby. In the other room, Mason had already begun to draw. He sat cross-legged near the window, cradling his sketchbook and using short, frantic strokes. Marley watched silently from a few feet away, arms wrapped around her knees. Her expression was one of quiet concern, the kind that only came from knowing how fragile healing could be. When Eli returned to the room, Mason didn't look up, but held out his sketchbook. The page was filled with heavy charcoal lines. In the center stood a dog, clearly a German shepherd, but drawn in overlapping layers. The first outline was bold and upright. Over it, a second figure, crouched, and a third, curled in a tight, shaking ball. Around all three forms was a thick black shadow shaped like a man's silhouette, faceless and looming. "This is him," Mason whispered, "but he keeps hiding inside different versions." Eli knelt down beside the boy, surprised by the precision of the drawing, by the emotional accuracy it captured. "You think he's scared of himself?" "He's scared of who they made him," Mason replied without hesitation. That night, as the city dimmed into orange-lit silence, Eli sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and a cup of tea that had gone cold. He stared at the whistle sitting beside the notepad and flipped through pages of memories, missions, routines, signals he hadn't thought about in years. Atlas had always responded with precision. He had been one of the fastest learners Eli had ever seen. Intelligent, focused, bonded. But the dog now? The dog who lunged at mirrors and flinched at whistles? Something didn't add up. As if summoned by his thoughts, Eli's phone vibrated. Nadia Wells. He answered, instantly alert. "Eli," she said, her voice tight. "I just got a call. No name. The man asked if we had a German shepherd tagged under the name Bolt." "Bolt?" Eli repeated. "Yes." He sounded like he was trying to confirm something without giving anything away. The number was blocked. Eli gripped the phone tighter. Atlas's records never mentioned that name. "I checked. Nothing official. But if this guy knows that name, there's more to Atlas's story than we thought." Eli didn't speak right away. The word Bolt clanged in his head, uncomfortably familiar. "That was never his call sign," Eli murmured. "No," Nadia agreed, "but it could have been someone else's." That night, Eli walked back to the hallway mirror. He looked at his own reflection in the dim light, saw the lines on his face, the shadows under his eyes, the man he barely recognized anymore. He lifted the mirror and turned it to face the wall. In the living room, Atlas lay by the door, his head resting on his paws. When Eli passed by, he opened one eye but didn't move. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it wasn't fear either. Back in the kitchen, Marley sat with Mason at the table, helping him draw a lighthouse. Mason had insisted on adding a large dog curled at the foot of the tower. "This one isn't hiding," he said simply. And for the first time, Atlas shifted closer, enough that his side brushed gently against Eli's leg as he lay down beside the chair. Eli didn't move. He didn't say anything. But inside, something cracked open. The sky broke open just after midnight. Rain battered the rooftops of Redbridge in thick, unrelenting sheets, and the wind howled between alleyways like a wounded animal. Eli lay in bed, arms folded behind his head, eyes fixed on the ceiling, where the shadows flickered with each flash of lightning. Sleep was a stranger that night, lingering at the edge of his senses but refusing to cross the threshold. Thunder cracked so close that the window rattled. That was when Eli noticed it, the soft scuff of nails against the hardwood. He lifted his head and turned. Atlas stood at the bedroom door. The German shepherd didn't move further. His tall frame filled the doorway like a statue carved from vigilance itself. His posture was tense, alert, but his eyes weren't scanning for threats. They were locked onto Eli. The next rumble of thunder vibrated through the house. Atlas didn't flinch. He remained at the threshold, his tail low but steady, head slightly raised, like a soldier on watch. Eli pushed himself up slowly, his joints aching from more than just age. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked back at the dog. "You used to sleep through shelling," he murmured. "Now you stand guard over thunder." Atlas didn't react, but he didn't leave either. Rain drummed harder against the windows as Eli laid back down, this time leaving the door open wider. When he closed his eyes, sleep finally came, but it was not kind. He dreamed of sand, of smoke curling above crumbling concrete, of a firefight that had gone wrong. Voices shouted. Gunfire cracked like bones. He was lying in the dirt, unable to move, blood pooling from a torn leg. He remembered calling for Rex, his canine partner, a lean black shepherd with a sharp gait and a clever mind. But Rex never came. Instead, through the haze, another form appeared. Broader, golden brown, eyes sharp but uncertain. It was Atlas. Not from memory, but from something else, something buried. The dream twisted. Atlas stood over Eli, barking once, sharp and demanding. Then the barking stopped. In the silence that followed, Eli saw a collar around the dog's neck. Not military issue, but black nylon with red stitching. And on it, a nameplate that read, Bolt. Eli jerked awake. The storm still raged outside, but the room was quiet. He sat up, breath catching, and turned to look at the door. Atlas was gone. A moment later, he heard it. A soft scratching at the front door downstairs. He rushed down barefoot and opened it to find Mason standing in the downpour, soaked to the bone, his sketchbook clutched tightly to his chest. His face was pale, lips trembling, but not from cold. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered. Eli pulled the boy inside without a word, wrapping a towel around him. The living room was dim, lit only by the flickering lamp near the bookshelf. Atlas was already there, lying by the couch, watching Mason closely. Not wary, but watchful, like he understood something others didn't. Mason dropped to his knees beside the dog. He didn't speak, didn't reach out, just stared at Atlas with wide, scared eyes. And Atlas moved. The big shepherd shifted forward, cautiously, then extended his neck. His nose gently nudged Mason's hand. Then he licked it. Just once, soft and slow. Mason's shoulders shook, not from fear, but release. His small arms wrapped around Atlas's neck, and the dog didn't pull away. He stayed perfectly still, a silent anchor in the middle of a child's storm. Eli stepped back, watching the scene unfold with something like reverence. Later, after Mason had changed into dry clothes and fallen asleep on the couch, Marley arrived. Her eyes were wide, her curls clinging to her cheeks from the rain. She had a laptop tucked under one arm and a fury of urgency in her step. "I saw something," she said, lowering her voice as she entered the kitchen. "Eli, you need to see this." She placed the laptop on the table and opened a browser tab. The video was grainy, clearly recorded on an old phone. It showed a collapsed building, an industrial warehouse of some kind, and a crew of first responders digging through rubble. The camera panned wildly, unfocused, until it fixed on a dog, a German shepherd, Atlas, covered in dust, limping but focused and fast. The footage showed him dragging a child out from under a beam and barking sharply until medics came running. "That's him," Eli whispered. Marley nodded. "It was uploaded 4 years ago by a now-defunct channel that belonged to a company called Helix Tactical Solutions, a private contractor." "Helix?" Eli's brow furrowed. "That's not military." "No," Marley said. "It's civilian, unregulated. They were investigated 2 years ago for illegal training practices, including K9 trauma-based conditioning. Dogs were retrained to respond only to certain people. Some were used for less than legal work overseas." Eli's breath grew heavy. "They renamed him." Marley tapped the screen. "Look here. Metadata shows the original fill name was Bolt_rescue_clip_12. They renamed him Bolt. That's why he didn't respond to you. That's why he flinches at commands. He wasn't just lost. He was reprogrammed." Outside, thunder cracked again. This time, Atlas didn't move. He lay near the couch, his head resting on Mason's feet, eyes half closed. Eli sat down slowly, the weight of it all pressing against his chest. "He was never supposed to come back," he said. Marley looked at him carefully. "But he did." They were quiet for a long while, listening to the rhythm of rain and the soft breaths of a boy asleep beside a dog who had once been someone else. The air in Redbridge's Central Park was crisp with early spring chill, the kind that hadn't yet decided whether to yield to sunshine or retreat into late frost. Beneath the budding canopy of trees, families strolled along the winding paths. Joggers paced past benches still wet from yesterday's rain, and scattered laughter mingled with the distant thrum of traffic. It was the first time in years Eli Whitaker had set foot in the park. He walked slowly, his cane tapping lightly against the gravel path, while Atlas trotted beside him on a long lead. The shepherd's gait had grown steadier over the past week, though there was still a stiffness in his movements, especially when sounds grew sudden or sharp. He wore a black tactical collar with no tags, just a small brass loop that once held a service ID. Eli had chosen this morning intentionally. The park was not yet crowded, and he needed space to test something. Since the storm, Atlas had grown more responsive, more present, still cautious, still haunted, but no longer entirely lost. Now Eli wanted to see if any part of the dog he once trained, trusted, still lived beneath the rewired shell. They moved to a quiet clearing near the southern edge of the park, where a wide lawn opened between two rows of trees. Eli dropped the leash but kept close, then stepped back and gave a sharp command. "Sit!" Atlas looked at him but didn't move. Eli repeated the order, firm but not loud. A long pause. Then Atlas lowered his hindquarters, slow and mechanical, as if replaying an old tape buried deep in his mind. "Down!" Atlas flinched slightly, then obeyed, his chest pressing to the grass, head low. Eli's breath caught. It wasn't perfect, but it was there. He took a few steps back and gave the next command, one they hadn't used in years. "Guard!" Atlas's ears twitched, his muscles tensed. But before he could respond, a man passed nearby, cutting across the edge of the field. He was tall, built broad through the shoulders, and walked with the easy confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He wore faded jeans, tan boots, and an olive-green military-style jacket with a name patch, faded but still legible. Harrow. Eli didn't notice him at first, but Atlas did. The change was immediate. The shepherd's head shot up, ears forward, eyes wide and fixed. His body launched forward without warning, paws tearing across the lawn. "Atlas, no!" Eli's shout went unheard. The man had only just turned toward the commotion when Atlas collided with him, front legs braced against his chest, teeth bared but not biting. Yet. The man stumbled backward, falling hard into the grass, arms raised instinctively. Atlas stood over him, snarling, tail rigid, eyes wild with something deeper than fear, something like recognition. "Get off!" the man barked, not panicked, but firm. Eli rushed to them, his leg aching with each stride. "Atlas, stand down!" It took 3 tries, but on the third command, Atlas relented. He backed away, body still taut, eyes still burning into the man on the ground. Eli grabbed the leash and pulled Atlas back. The dog resisted for a moment, then slowly sat, trembling. The man stood, brushing himself off. His face was hard, late 40s, weathered from sun and age, with short-cropped blonde hair and a thin scar beneath his left eye. He gave off the quiet authority of someone who had seen war up close and learned to speak little about it. "You his handler?" he asked gruffly. "I was," Eli replied, catching his breath. "I thought he was retired. Guess he remembers more than I thought." The man gave Atlas a long look. "That's not memory. That's programming." Eli's stomach turned. "Do I know you?" The man hesitated, then extended a hand. "Colt Harrow, K-9 instructor. Used to be with Helix Tactical. Maybe you've heard the name." Eli didn't take the hand. "I've heard of Helix, private outfit, not known for ethical work." Colt's expression didn't change. "We did what needed doing, most of the time." Atlas growled low, a sound Eli hadn't heard in days. Colt looked at the shepherd, then back at Eli. "You shouldn't be walking that dog in public. He's not dangerous. He just tackled a stranger. He remembered something." Colt crossed his arms. "That's the problem. Some dogs, when they remember, they don't come back the same. You're trying to dig up a ghost, Whitaker. What if what you find isn't your partner, but a weapon with a name?" Eli's hands tightened around the leash. "What did you do to him?" Colt didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked back to Atlas, now panting, shoulders twitching slightly with agitation. "We took dogs that were abandoned by the military, ones declared unfit or unstable. We gave them structure, purpose." "You mean you reprogrammed them to attack civilians on cue?" Colt's jaw clenched. "No one said that. You didn't have to." Eli stepped closer. "He had a name. Atlas. He had loyalty, and you stripped it away to turn him into Bolt." Colt's face twitched, just once. "Bolt was one of our best, responsive, unshakable, and broken. A long silence passed between them. Finally, Colt said, "I'm not here to fight with you. Just watch yourself. That dog isn't what you remember, and if you push too hard, you won't like what comes back." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the gravel path like smoke in the wind. Eli stood for a long time, hand resting on Atlas's back, feeling the rapid beat of the shepherd's heart beneath his palm. He wasn't sure whether to be grateful or terrified that the dog still had that fire inside him. But one thing was clear. There were pieces missing in Atlas's mind, fragments glued together wrong, and whatever Helix had done, they hadn't destroyed him. Not completely. Back home, Eli opened an old wooden box in his closet and pulled out a flash drive. It had sat there for years, unopened. It contained training logs, voice command samples, and hours of footage from missions with Atlas. Maybe, he thought, it was time to remind the dog, not what they turned him into, but who he used to be. The sun had not yet risen above the rooftops of Redbridge, and the morning air clung to the earth with a cool stillness. In the back lot behind Eli's house, an old training course had begun to take shape, makeshift barricades crafted from upturned pallets, rope lines strung between fence posts, and faded orange cones forming a perimeter. It wasn't much, but it resembled the layout of the drills Eli and Atlas had once trained in, a field where trust had been forged under the weight of expectation and danger. Eli stood at the center, dressed in old tactical pants and a black training vest, the seams stretched and worn. He moved with a quiet deliberation, cane in one hand, his other gripping a short lead clipped to Atlas's collar. The German shepherd stood beside him, upright and focused, though his body was tense with the kind of energy Eli had come to understand as caution. Not aggression, but anticipation. "All right," Eli murmured, "let's find out what's left of you." He led Atlas to the start of the course and removed the leash. Atlas didn't move, but his ears swiveled toward Eli's voice. "Position!" Eli ordered firmly. After a pause, Atlas stepped to Eli's left side, body angled slightly forward, just as he once had during missions. "Down!" Atlas lay flat, not with hesitation, but with practiced precision. Eli stepped 5 paces forward and dropped to the ground suddenly, clutching his thigh and letting out a pained groan. "Help!" he gasped, the cue they used in the field to trigger protective stance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Atlas surged forward. He crossed the space between them in a few bounding strides and stopped just short of Eli's body. He stood over him, shoulders squared, head high, tail low and steady, his body angled outward, eyes scanning the surroundings. Eli barely dared to breathe. This wasn't instinct alone. It was memory. "Good boy," he said softly. Atlas turned his head. His eyes met Eli's. Then, with no command, he lowered his head and pressed his forehead gently against Eli's. The moment was still, delicate as breath. Eli closed his eyes, hand rising to rest against the thick fur of Atlas's neck. "I knew you were still in there," he whispered. That afternoon, Marley arrived with Mason and a stack of paper flowers the boy had made from colored construction sheets. Her smile was tired but bright, her auburn curls tucked beneath a woven headband. She wore a soft lavender sweater over jeans splattered with paint, and her canvas bag was filled with art supplies and loose sketches. "I have an idea," she said as she stepped into Eli's kitchen. "You might hate it." "That's a great way to start," Eli replied, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. "I spoke with Dr. Lindsley," she said, taking a seat. "She coordinates therapy dogs at the Eastbridge Center. Most are golden retrievers or labs, but they've recently started integrating retired service dogs, ones with calm temperaments. I think Atlas could be a good candidate." Eli looked unconvinced. "You want to put him with traumatized kids? Marley? He tackled a man last week." "He also calmed Mason during a lightning storm," she said. "He didn't flinch, didn't growl, he just laid beside him. That kind of presence is powerful, Eli. I'm not saying he's not special, but he's not ready." Marley leaned forward. "You're not ready. There's a difference." He didn't argue. Because she was right. That night, after Marley and Mason left, Eli received a call from Nadia. Her voice was taut, clipped in a way that only happened when she was holding something heavy. "I found something," she said. She explained that she'd gone back through Atlas's original military records after the Bolt footage had resurfaced. What she found shocked her. A confidential incident report buried in a classified folder, marked with 3 layers of redacted clearance. It stated that K90248, Atlas, had been declared deceased after a mission gone wrong in Syria, during an extraction that left 3 operators dead and 1 MIA. The dog was presumed killed in the blast. But there was no physical confirmation, Nadia said, just a memo signed by someone in a private contractor unit, Helix Tactical. They filed the termination certificate. It was never validated. Someone covered it up, Eli said, his voice like gravel. They didn't lose him. They took him. And now he's alive, and the only witness to whatever happened that day. Eli sat in silence, the weight of truth heavy in his chest. Atlas wasn't just a forgotten soldier. He was a secret someone had tried to bury. Later that night, Eli stood outside beneath the faint orange glow of the porch light. Atlas lay on the step, head resting on his paws. The air was still, stars hidden behind drifting clouds. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the old metal ID tag he'd kept in his drawer. The lettering was worn, but still legible. Atlas K90248, USMC. He knelt and clipped the tag to the collar. You earned it back, he said. Not because of what they made you into, but because of what you chose to be again. Atlas didn't move, but his tail thumped once against the wood. The next morning, Marley called with an update. Dr. Lindsley had agreed to a supervised observation session with Atlas and a small group of children. Nothing formal, just a chance to see how he behaved in a quiet room. Eli hesitated. I'll think about it. You're not just saving him, Marley said gently. He might be saving you too. Eli looked down at Atlas, who was sitting by the window, watching the street with that focused stillness of a sentinel. Maybe, he thought, she was right. The dream came like wildfire. Eli was standing in the middle of a desert clearing, boots half buried in dust, rifle slung across his chest, the air filled with distant radio static. He turned his head, and beside him, Atlas stood, fully geared, alert, the red dawn light glinting off his black and tan coat. But something was off. The sky shimmered unnaturally, and when Eli reached down to touch Atlas's collar, it wasn't his. The tag read, Bolt Tactical Canine Unit. And when Eli gave a command, stay, Atlas growled, low, dangerous, then turned his back and walked into the smoke. Eli awoke with a start, heart hammering against his ribs, the room still cloaked in early dawn haze. He was already reaching for his phone on the nightstand when it buzzed. Caller ID, unknown, he answered. A familiar voice, calm but edged with gravel, spoke through the line. Morning, Whitaker. Eli sat up slowly. Colt? You ever wonder what they programmed him for after he was taken? Colt's tone was casual, but laced with implication. I stopped wondering, I started remembering. You think memory's the same thing as truth? Eli didn't answer. Colt continued. They didn't just break him, they rewrote him. Bolt wasn't trained to protect. He was built to obey, no matter the target, even if it was his own handler. Eli's jaw tightened. But he didn't. No, Colt said after a pause. He didn't. And that's what makes him dangerous now. Not because of what we made him, but because he chose not to follow through. That kind of failure doesn't go unnoticed. You saying someone's still looking for him? I'm saying, Colt replied, his voice low, you better figure out who he is now, before someone tries to turn him back. The line went dead. Eli stared at the screen, then at the sleeping figure of Atlas curled at the foot of his bed, breathing slow and steady. The weight of that call pressed against his chest, like armor he hadn't worn in years. Later that morning, Eli drove to the old military hospital, where he'd once spent 6 weeks recovering from a shrapnel wound to his leg. The building had since been converted into a veterans rehabilitation center, but the bones of it remained. Familiar walls, familiar corridors. He parked the truck and opened the door. Atlas leapt down onto the pavement, ears perked, nose flaring. Without hesitation, he walked ahead, taking the lead without command. Eli followed, watching the shepherd navigate the grounds like he had been there yesterday, pausing at intersections, turning corners before Eli could recall the layout. They reached the back courtyard, a quiet, walled garden that had been Eli's only sanctuary during recovery. Atlas walked straight to the bench beneath the white-barked sycamore tree and sat. Eli slowly joined him. You remember? He murmured. Atlas looked at him. Not with confusion, not with fear, but with clarity, with presence. You came back. That afternoon, Marley invited Eli and Atlas to a children's group art session at the Eastbridge Center. The room was bright, filled with color and sunlight, scattered paintbrushes, bean bags, and the low murmur of laughter. Mason was already there, seated near the back, working intently on a new project. Eli stood by the doorway, watching as Atlas moved between the kids, tail low, body relaxed. One girl, small, blonde, freckles spattered across her nose, reached out to gently stroke his head. Atlas leaned into her hand, eyes soft. Marley came up beside Eli, arms folded lightly. She wore a navy blouse with specks of green paint on the sleeves, and her usual quiet warmth in her eyes. "He's different here," she said, "like he knows this is his purpose." Eli nodded. Maybe it always was. Then it happened. The back door, an old weighted fire door, squealed open, and the pneumatic hinge failed. It slammed hard against the wall with a deafening bang. Mason froze, his shoulders tensed, his hands clenched around his sketch pad. Then he bolted toward the door, knocking over a chair as he ran, eyes wild with panic. "Wait!" Marley called, rushing after him. But Atlas was faster. The shepherd sprinted across the room, overtaking the adults, weaving through furniture and art tables. He reached the corridor just as Mason passed the maintenance closet, and in that split second, the latch above the ceiling panel gave way. A storage hatch dropped open with a loud creak, and a metal door frame, detached from poor repair, began to fall. Atlas lunged. His body hit Mason squarely in the chest, knocking the boy out of the fall zone. The frame slammed to the floor inches from where Mason had been. Silence fell. Then the children screamed, and staff rushed in. Marley dropped to her knees, pulling Mason into her arms. The boy trembled, breath shallow, but he was unhurt. Atlas stood between them and the fallen panel, unmoving. Marley looked up, tears brimming. "He didn't think. He just acted." Eli stepped forward and laid a hand on Atlas's shoulder. "He didn't need his old memories to know what to do," Marley whispered. "He chose this." That night, as the sun set over Redbridge in a haze of orange and rose, Eli sat on the back steps of his house, Atlas lying beside him, eyes half-lidded with contentment. He remembered what Colt had said, that memory and truth weren't always the same, but maybe they didn't have to be. Maybe what mattered more was choice, and Atlas had chosen. Not who he was built to be, but who he wanted to be now. The wind swept softly across the city plaza, carrying with it the mingled scents of blooming dogwood and fresh-cut grass. Bunting and muted tones of navy, silver, and green hung from lampposts and awnings, fluttering gently under the overcast sky. Folding chairs lined the outdoor stage, and at the edge of the crowd, children in handmade paper hats stood beside military veterans, retired handlers, and therapy dog volunteers. The banner above read, "Silent Warriors, a day of honor and healing." Eli Whitaker stood near the rear of the stage, his figure still and solid in a charcoal suit that fit snug over his broad shoulders and clean white shirt. His cane was tucked beneath one arm, though he hadn't needed it as much lately. Beside him, Atlas sat with his head held high, black and tan coat gleaming with a brushed sheen, a navy blue bandana knotted loosely around his neck that read, "In service still." The two had been invited to close the ceremony, but as Eli scanned the crowd, it was never about speeches. It was about standing still and letting others see what resilience looked like. Not perfection, not some polished version of healing, but real, flawed survival. Marley stood in the front row, her auburn curls pinned back, wearing a simple green dress beneath a gray cardigan. Mason sat on her hip, wrapped around her like ivy on a tree, his cheek resting on her shoulder, one hand clutching a drawing. Dr. Nadia Wells stood nearby, speaking quietly with a tall, broad-shouldered woman in a beige blazer and polished black shoes. Miranda Kane, a representative from the Regional Animal Recovery Fund. Miranda was in her 50s with stern but kind eyes and a no-nonsense tone that came from years of nonprofit work. It had been Nadia who secured the grant, but it was Miranda who had fast-tracked approval for a new center, the Atlas program, designed to rehabilitate retired K-9S and retrain them for civilian emotional support work. It would open in 4 months, with Atlas as its symbolic first ambassador. Eli stepped onto the stage when his name was called. The crowd quieted, but not with forced attention. There was an ease to their stillness, the kind that came from respect, not obligation. He took the microphone, adjusted it slightly, then rested his palm on Atlas's back. "I was never a man of many words," he began, "and I'm still not." A few soft chuckles stirred. "I spent years in combat, and the years after, in silence. Sometimes because I couldn't speak, sometimes because I didn't want to." He looked down at Atlas. "But there was someone who stayed when I couldn't, someone who didn't need words to understand what I had lost." He paused, lifting a small object from his coat pocket, a military-issue whistle, the same one he'd buried at the back of his drawer all those months ago. "I used to use this to control a soldier, but today I'd like to use it to call a friend." He raised the whistle to his lips, one short blow, one long. Atlas, who had been lying calmly beside the podium, stood slowly. Then, without command, he trotted across the stage, tail level, gaze locked on Eli. When he reached his side, he didn't sit. He leaned into Eli, pressing his head against his leg. The crowd rose to its feet, the applause echoing beneath the open sky. Later, after the ceremony ended and people mingled around refreshment tables and vendor booths, Eli joined Marley and Mason near the display tent. Mason had just finished handing his drawing to a volunteer who was collecting artwork for a community mural. "Can I show you what I made?" he asked Eli, holding up a second version he had kept. Eli knelt beside him, knees groaning softly. The drawing was made with colored pencils on textured paper. Beneath a tall street lamp stood 3 figures, a man with gray hair and a cane, a large German shepherd with dark eyes, and a small boy with a blue hoodie. Behind them, the sky was filled with stars, but instead of constellations, they were shaped like medals, tags, and paw prints. Above the scene, Mason had written in careful block letters, "Home is where you don't have to be fixed to be loved." Eli didn't speak. He didn't need to. Marley slipped her hand into his. "We finalized the paperwork this morning," she whispered. "He's mine now, officially." He turned to her. "No, he's ours." That evening, back at the house, the air was quiet. Mason had fallen asleep on the couch, curled in a blanket that still smelled faintly of paint and lemon soap. Marley was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she unpacked a tin of leftovers from the ceremony. Eli sat on the back step, watching the horizon fade into purple. Atlas lay beside him, stretched out on his side, eyes blinking slowly. Eli reached over and scratched behind his ears. "You were never just a tool, never just a soldier. You were always more." Atlas shifted, resting his head on Eli's boot. "You don't have to remember what they made you for," Eli whispered, "because I remember who you really are." The shepherd let out a slow, contented sigh. A moment passed. Then Eli spoke again, barely above a breath. "I don't need you to remember, because you chose to stay. Sometimes, the greatest miracles come not in thunder or lightning, but in silence, in the steady gaze of a loyal dog who refuses to give up on the broken man beside him." Atlas didn't need perfect memory to become a hero again. He simply needed to choose love over fear, trust over programming, and presence over the past. Just like that, God reminds us, we are not what we were. We are what we choose today, through grace. Even when the world sees only damage, He sees potential. Even when we forget who we are, He never forgets whose we are. In Atlas's quiet decision to stay, to protect, and to forgive the pain burned into his bones, we witness something holy, a reflection of the way God stays with us through trauma, through confusion, through storm. Because love, true divine unconditional love, is not a memory, it's a choice, a calling, a miracle. So tonight, may you feel that kind of grace in your own story. May God bless the warriors who walk on 4 legs and the ones who carry invisible scars. And may you always remember, your past does not disqualify you from being someone's miracle. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Click like to let this message reach others who need it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of healing, faith, and hope. And may the Lord bless you and your family today with peace, protection, and purpose.